Okay. Well, good morning to everyone. We've got some visitors in the audience, and we're very excited to have you with us this morning. As Dan mentioned, we've got some gaps in our pews, even beyond kind of the normal for what we've experienced in the past few months, and so we're happy to have you join us this morning. I'm obviously not a normal speaker. Dempsey does a great job, so I'm happy to pass this back to him when he gets back. I wanted to talk this morning about stories. Our family loves a good story. We read stories every night before bed. I secretly dread the day when my kids won't want us to read to them anymore before bedtime. But we take about 30 minutes or so and we read a story before bed and then a Bible story before bed and then proceed kind of with the rest of the bedtime routine. And it's a time that our family can kind of all be together there. We're settling down at the end of the day and we're all just listening to a story together, kind of enjoying it together and experiencing it together. And we do it every single night, and it's a great thing that I've always enjoyed that we do. Now, there are all kinds of stories. Some stories are fiction. Those are kind of the majority of the ones that we read. Whenever we go watch a movie, we're usually watching some sort of fictional story. Some stories are tall tales, right? There may be some sort of elements of truth to them, but a lot of times those elements get embellished for entertainment's sake. Amanda's mom is really good at kind of spinning a good yarn for the kids. Sometimes they go visit mermaids on Mars. Sometimes they go to the land of the Bontusis. She's just really good at kind of spinning something up right off the top of her head. And, I love going to the storytelling festivals and just hearing somebody spin a good yarn. It's always enjoyable when somebody can do it well. Some of the most interesting stories, though, are the true ones. We hear those types of stories, and we can relate to them. They take place in our world. They take place with real people. And so a lot of times we can relate to those stories. Sometimes the details are a little bit fantastical. We think that can't possibly be what actually happened, and yet, if it's a historical account, it did. And so stories like that can be inspiring because I think we can relate to them a lot of times. We hear them sometimes and we think, that could be me. That could be me. Then again, sometimes we hear them and we think, that could be me. Or it could have been me. I think when we're reading through the Bible, and we're especially reading through the Gospels, we come across a major character there, and that's Peter, Simon Peter. And we read Peter's story, and it's kind of interspersed throughout the Gospel account. Certainly the Gospels are all about Jesus Christ, and about how he came to earth, how he came to save us. And yet we get this individual, Peter, who walked with Jesus. He went everywhere with him throughout his ministry. And we constantly see how Peter is relating to Jesus, how Peter follows Jesus, and how he interacts with Jesus. And not only do we get his interactions with Jesus, a lot of times we get some insight into Peter himself. Now, there have been times that I have been tempted to look down on Peter. Here he is with the Lord. He has seen everything. He sees all the miracles. He sees all the fantastic things that Jesus has done. He's heard all of Jesus' words. And so many times, he just misses the mark. He either is impetuous or brash or asks questions that we think he probably should have known the answer to. And so the temptation is that we might think, well, if I were in Peter's shoes, I would have gotten that. I would have understood. I think that's a very dangerous assumption to make sometimes. This morning I wanted to look at Peter's story. I wanted to kind of go through his life and maybe take some things from it. And maybe notice that we're not quite so different from Peter. So we're just going to pick up right at the beginning of Peter's story. As Dan said, this is not changing up here, so let's see if I can get it on the presenter view. That's all right, as long as it's changing for you all. Okay, so Peter comes onto the scene, and he's a simple fisherman. This is chapter 1 in Peter's story. When we first meet him, his name isn't Peter, he's known as Simon. Now, Simon is the son of a man named Jonas, or John in some translations. He has a brother named Andrew. We see Andrew in John chapter 1, verses 41 and 42. Peter's a fisherman by trade. And when we look at his story, we look at the early details of what he's doing. He's going out at night and he's casting nets into the sea to catch fish and bring in a haul so that his family can live and he can provide for them. This is probably a family-owned business. His father probably taught him to fish. In Jewish society, a trade was usually passed down from father to son. And he's also got partners, not only his brother Andrew, but also the sons of Zebedee, John and James. A commenter once talked about this kind of labor, this fishing trade. You know, we think of fishing today, and a lot of times we go fishing for pleasure. We go out on a boat, we enjoy some time out on the water, we cast a line, sit in the water, enjoy the sunshine, and just kind of laze the day away, hoping that maybe we'll get something and have a good story for it. These guys are fishing in bulk. They're doing this to survive. And so one commenter said that about this job, this isn't as easy as we might think it is. He said, fishing made for grimy, smelly, bloody, back-breaking work. And the fishermen were despised by elites and sophisticates who nonetheless enjoyed the product of the fishermen's labors. If you've ever been out deep sea fishing, you know you got to make the chum first. And that's gross work. These guys were into all of this. They're catching fish, they're processing fish. They're not taking out a Yeti cooler. They're bringing in the fish and trying to keep it as fresh as they can so they can sell it in the market. This is hard work. And they're hauling those nets in and out of that boat constantly. Now, one other thing about this, Peter's partner and brother is Andrew, as we've already mentioned. Andrew's not only a fisherman, but he's also, as we see in John's gospel, a follower of John the Baptist. And so as a result, Andrew comes into contact with Jesus. And once Andrew hears Jesus speak, and he hears John declare that Jesus is the Messiah, Andrew goes and gets Peter, or goes and gets Simon, and brings him with him, so that he can hear Jesus speak. And he even tells him, we have found the Messiah, the promised one. Jesus, upon meeting Simon, then gives him the name that we most frequently know, Peter, which also means rock. Now, something here is going to connect to the next part of the story. Augustine said that Jesus chose not kings, senators, or philosophers, or orators, but he chose common, poor, and untaught fishermen. And we'll see later on in Peter's story that he's called an untaught, he's recognized as an untaught man. Even his accent gives him away. You kind of think of it like a southern person. Your accent sometimes makes you maybe seem less intelligent. I can say that because I have that. But some people might think less of you because of where your accent is. But these guys are untaught, they're untrained, they don't have any formal training. And it's not that they don't try, it's not that they don't know Jewish customs or what some things they need to know, but they're not the elite, they're not the scholars. And so what we have then here is the Messiah, the one the Jews have been waiting for hundreds of years. He was going to come back, he was going to lead them to glory, he was going to rid them of the Roman Empire and make them the King of Kings on earth. And what does he do? He comes back, and some of the first people he interacts with and forms a close relationship with are poor, uneducated fishermen from Galilee, one of the least prominent provinces in this part of Palestine. Not only that, but he's going to choose some of these men to be his first disciples. The question is why? Why would Jesus choose these men? And I think that, again, goes to the next part of the story. Peter's a willing follower. So sometime after their initial meeting, Jesus comes to Peter and Andrew's boat on the shore, and he asks them to put out a ways and cast their nets over the side. Now, of course, we know Peter's reply, Lord, we fished all night long. We've worked hard, and we've gotten nothing. There's nothing there. But at your word, we will cast them again. And so we know how this story plays out. They cast the nets over the side of the boat, and the haul of fish is so great that the boat starts to become overwhelmed, and they have to call in partners from other boats to come and assist with the haul. And so for Peter, this miracle confirms Jesus as the Messiah. There is no doubt in Peter's mind. That's why he says, Lord, go away from me, for I'm a sinful man. There's no doubt for Peter that this is the Messiah. And so when they go back to shore, they're mending their nets. They're at their boats, they're mending their nets. And Jesus comes up to them and tells them, as we know, follow me. Well, what do? They immediately follow. And that's the word that all the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all use that same exact word. They refer to the response as immediate. Now, Jesus is later going to say to his disciples and in his teaching that whoever of you that does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Well, what we get right here is Peter and his brother and partners exemplifying this exact attitude. And I would submit that's one of the reasons that Jesus probably chose these men. He knew their hearts. He knew their character and their faith, and that they would follow him, and that they would work hard. Men in higher positions probably would not have been so willing to leave all that they had and follow Jesus. Remember the rich young ruler? He was very sad when he had to give up all that he had. But Peter and Andrew and James and John, they follow, and they do it immediately. Not only do they follow, but Peter becomes a faithful companion of the Lord. Peter would go on to become one of Jesus' most loyal companions and friends throughout the gospel accounts. Whenever Jesus selects smaller groups to accompany him from time to time, as he's going about his activities, Peter is almost always among those that are present. We see that in Mark 5, Mark 9, Luke chapter 8. On one occasion, we might remember that Jesus loses many followers because they say his teaching is too difficult to understand. This is just after Jesus gave the whole oration about you need to eat my body and drink of my blood, and all those things. And people are saying, this is too hard. Who could possibly understand this? And then in John chapter 6, after all those people leave, many of Jesus' disciples, followers, leave him. And so then we presumably have the 12, and they stay around. And Jesus looks to them and asks them the question, you don't want to go away too, do you? And Peter makes this answer, and I think it says so much about his character. Lord, you have the words of eternal life. Who else are we going to go to? We know and have come to believe that you are the Messiah. John chapter 6, verse 60. Peter's reply shows the level of loyalty to Jesus. Even though he too may not always understand Jesus' teaching, he has faith in the one doing the teaching. And so he knows there's something there that even though he might not get it to start with, he needs it. And that's going to be the way to eternal life. And so when others would run from hard things and hard work, hard teaching, Peter shows his trust in Jesus because he's a faithful companion. He's loyal. In other places, we see Peter as an astonished eyewitness. In 2 Peter 1:16, Peter would later go on to say that we were eyewitnesses of his majesty, of Jesus' majesty. Now, Peter was present, as we've already mentioned, for multiple occasions where the power and authority of Jesus were on full miraculous display. We might think of the feeding of the 5,000. We might think of Jesus walking on the stormy seas out to the boat. We might think of Jesus being asleep in the boat, and when he wakes up with a simple word, he calms the storm around him. Peter sees all these things. He's present for all of them to witness them. But probably nowhere was the majesty of Jesus more literally on display than at the Transfiguration. In Matthew 17, in Mark 9, in Luke 9, they all record this event where Jesus takes Peter and James and John up onto the mountain, and he's transfigured there. His countenance is changed to that of a brilliant, dazzling, white, heavenly light shining down. And of course, Moses and Elijah also joined him there. And so Peter, James, and John, they witnessed this. Somebody said that this is probably reminiscent of Moses taking Aaron and Nadab and Abihu up to Sinai. And when we think about how significant that event was, and then translate it over to what's happening at the Transfiguration, I think we can get a sense of kind of what's happening and of how Peter and James and John are feeling as a result. They are described as being terrified and overwhelmed at the sight of the transfigured Jesus. On so many occasions, just when Peter thought he had seen everything, Jesus would surprise with something even greater. And of course, later on down the road, that's going to be outdone by the fact that Jesus is resurrected. And yet, with all that experience, with walking with Jesus, so many times Peter is a slow learner. And that's okay. Jesus knows that. But Peter's a slow learner. His zealous faith notwithstanding, we see Peter struggle to come to grips with Jesus sometimes, don't we? But considering the fact of Jesus being the Son of God and all, it's easy to see why Peter might miss the mark sometimes in the way that he does. For instance, in John chapter 13, John recounts Jesus washing the disciples' feet, right? Here's Jesus taking on a lowly task, the task of a servant. And Peter can't understand why the master of heaven and earth, who can calm the storm at a word, who can walk on the water, who can multiply food, who can do all these miracles, would stoop down and wash the dirt off of their grimy, nasty feet. He can't get it. And yet he needs to see it. He needs to see that here's an object lesson of selfless sacrifice and of fellowship of God with his people. Remember, that's what Jesus says. If I don't wash you, you cannot be with me. You can't be in fellowship with me. And so then, of course, Peter, both literally and figuratively, jumps in with both feet and says, not only my feet, Lord, but also all of me. Matthew 16 and Mark 8 then also recount Peter actually rebuking Jesus on another occasion for saying that Jesus would fulfill his purpose by dying at the hands of Jewish leaders. Again, God on earth, how is man going to harm him? So it makes sense that Peter, having seen Jesus' mastery over all things, that it would be an absurd thought that anyone could cause him to suffer, let alone kill him. Peter was a slow learner sometimes, and so are we. But you know what? Peter was also a zealous defender of Jesus. Loyal Peter also denies that he will abandon Jesus. He proclaims at one point, I will lay down my life for you, in John 13:37. And I think he means that. All four gospel writers record Peter's readiness to make good on that particular promise. Remember, Peter's in the garden with Jesus, and garrison of soldiers comes around from the temple. They're wielding clubs. They have overwhelming numbers for Jesus' small party there in the garden. And what does Peter do? He draws that sword and he goes a-charging. And he would have gotten Malchus's throat, probably, but he got an ear. Peter was ready to make good on that promise that he would lay down his life for Jesus. Now we know Peter's acting rashly. And Jesus calls him down and says, Peter, this is not the way that the kingdom of heaven is going to come in. But he's ready to defend his Lord at all costs. And I think that's an admirable trait. He's misguided in the way he goes about it, but he's ready to do it. So although he acts rashly, one thing is readily clear. Jesus seems to have no more ardent defender among men than Peter. So we continue in that particular story, and we know that Jesus is carried away. He allows himself to be carried away. He's already told Peter, do you not think that I could call legions of angels to come and rescue me? And yet I didn't. And I bet Peter's wondering why. Why would you not defend yourself? You have all power and authority. Why would you not do that? And so, again, just as all four Gospels recorded Peter defending his Lord, all four Gospel accounts record Peter denying his Lord. How would you like to have your worst moment recorded, not once, but 4 times, and passed down over thousands of years to be repeated over and over and over again? What Peter has. Loyal Peter, who's followed Jesus, denies Jesus, not once, but 3 times, just as Jesus said that he would. And it's not just that he denies Jesus. He denies even knowing Jesus or having associated with Jesus. I don't know this man. I don't know what you're talking about. There's no doubt that Peter's words are a lie. That's only one part of it. Peter's words are a lie, and they're a complete disavowal of any connection with his closest friend and his master. And yet, when we read this story, I've always thought about this, and this may be taking the text a little too far, but I've always thought about it this way. Isn't there a sense that Peter doesn't really know Jesus yet? This is a lie for sure. He knows Jesus. He's one of his closest friends. But there's also a sense in which Peter doesn't really know Jesus yet. And so everything he knows about Jesus says that he should be able to overcome this overwhelming force. And yet Jesus submits to him. And so Peter is reeling. He's at a loss. And so he's confused, he's angry, he's hurt, he's sad, he's scared. And so, again, let's place ourselves in Peter's situation. We would say, I would never deny my Lord. I would go to the death for him. I would never disavow my relationship with him. Would we? Can we 100% say that in the face of what Peter was facing? Either way, this account of Peter's denial and of his reaction to Jesus giving himself up is as raw and real as it gets for Peter. And it's important that we don't place ourselves above him for it. Again, would we have done the same? One of the most beautiful parts of the story, though, Peter is living with that failure for 3 days. 3 days. As heinous as his denials were, we see his remorse, we know his sorrow, and at the time of Jesus' resurrection, he has lived with his failure for days, probably playing it over and over again in his mind. And so then, after seeing the empty tomb, remember how quickly Peter and John got up and ran to the tomb when they heard that it was empty. After seeing the empty tomb, and even after seeing Jesus for the first time, there's still unresolved business between Jesus and Peter. And the thing is that Jesus knows it. He knows that there's an unresolved tension that still exists between them. But he also knows Peter's heart. He knows Peter feels awful about this. And so it's like when we get in a fight with someone that's very close to us, and then there's that tension between us for a time. And we wonder, what's going to break that? Who's going to bend first? How can we get back to what we had before? Certainly, that's got to be between Peter and Jesus at this point. And again, Jesus knows that. And so at the very end of John's gospel, we get this beautiful scene of the Lord reconciling with Peter. And we see the love and the care that he has for Peter. He doesn't call him down for it. He doesn't continually remind him of it. But instead, we see him take the first step in reconciliation. And he gives Peter as many opportunities to profess his love for him as Peter used to deny him. And I think that's a beautiful thing. It's this complete picture of forgiveness and acceptance and reconciliation. How relieved we are when we know we are once again at peace with the Lord. You know, whenever we go to the camps and, maybe one of the kids decides they want to be baptized right then and there. If I have a chance to talk to them afterwards, one of the things I always say to them is, this is one of the best night's sleep you'll ever get in your life. Now, we might fail and we might fall away from the Lord, but how beautiful it is to come back together and to reconcile with him and to know that we're in a right relationship with him and that we're at peace with him. And so how good Peter must have felt after this happened. Peter uses that as a stepping stone. And so as we see in Acts chapter 1 and 2, he becomes a bold proclaimer for Jesus. Peter does not waste the opportunity that Jesus affords him. And so the Peter that we see in Acts chapter 2 through 5 has his eyes firmly fixed on the gospel message. Now granted, he's got the gospel message explained more fully to him, and it's been realized in the risen Jesus. But Peter is focused on it. He knows his purpose, and he has a clear understanding of his mission for the Lord. And he is carrying it out with gusto. And so in one of the highest points of his story, he boldly proclaims the risen Jesus in Jerusalem and beyond, in good circumstances and in bad ones. He does it before large crowds, and he does it before single individuals. He does not waste his opportunity. Peter becomes a bold proclaimer of Jesus, because he knows the relationship he has with the Lord, and he knows what he needs to do. But let us not forget that as strong as Peter is, and in as good a position as he is, and as well as he's doing, he's still capable of erring. That impetuousness does not go away immediately. And so we see in the letter to the Galatian church, Paul writes that there's a time when he had to rebuke Peter. In Galatians chapter 2, he had to rebuke Peter to his face for showing favoritism to Jewish Christians. Again, none of us, though, are immune to backsliding or peer pressure. When we're faced with pressure, when we're faced with adverse circumstances, it can be tempting for us to backslide or to do things that don't readily proclaim Jesus in our words and our thoughts and our actions. Peter is an object lesson in error, yes, but he's also an object lesson in response to rebuke. We can determine, based on Peter's words later on, that he recognized Paul's words, and he took them to heart, and he made changes that were necessary. And so then the last part of Peter's story that we see in the New Testament is that of an expectant encourager. This one isn't a narrative portion of the New Testament. It's letters written by Peter himself. We get Peter's innermost thoughts in his own words. Peter's letters are some of the best evidence we have of his later life. In them, we see care for brethren. We get sober reminders about how we should live and act and speak. And we, most importantly, I think, see Peter's hope for eternity. And we see him encouraging others in that same hope. And he tells people to remain faithful to the Lord, even in the face of suffering. The first letter that Peter writes, really the main focus of it all is the one who suffers for Christ on earth will reign for him in heaven. And that's written to Jews that are spread out throughout the Roman Empire. We may experience suffering. We may experience hardship. We may experience pressure. But we have to remain faithful. And that's Peter's message. And even though we suffer, we will one day be with Christ. And so then we go to the second letter that Peter wrote. And I think really this is such a powerful letter. If these are some of the last words that Peter wrote, they were good ones. Peter writes there, grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord. And he challenges the Christians to avoid deception and error and pressure, and also to be a people of holy conduct and godliness as you wait for the day of God and hasten its coming. And we know that Peter's living that life as well. He's not only awaiting the Lord's return, he's encouraging others to do so as well. So, the question I would ask then, is Peter's story our story? I think we could do a lot worse than to have his same circumstances and have his same characteristics. But I think as we read through Peter's story, what we need to do is we need to see ourselves in that story. All these parts together make up Peter's story. This is his life. All the parts of our lives come together in a tapestry, both the good and the bad, to our life living as Christians among a broken world. And so I think when we put all those parts together, maybe it should challenge us to ask some questions of ourselves, just as we've seen with Peter. Are we living simply? Are we working hard like Peter did? Are we ready to follow Jesus and remain loyal to him and express that loyalty wherever it's questioned? Do we reflect on Jesus' awesome power at work in our lives and in his creation? Do we maintain a zeal for the Lord as Peter did? Do we know that we're imperfect and yet we're trying? Do we know that we occasionally fail, but we don't give up? Are we ready to teach in any circumstance, as Peter was in the book of Acts? And as we saw in Peter's letters, are we as Christians earnestly and eagerly looking forward to Jesus' return and encouraging others to do the same? Because that's our task. That's what we're supposed to do, both in our family lives, in our personal lives, and in our public lives. Are we earnestly looking forward to the Lord's return? Have you established a relationship with Jesus Christ? Is that relationship important enough to you that you're willing to drop everything and take him at his word and follow him wherever he'll go? Being willing to drop everything and count that sacrifice as loss for the sake of Christ. We would love to initiate that relationship, to baptize you in repentance, to bring you forth anew, a fresh start, reconciled with Christ, ready to start your walk with him. Are you a Peter and you've been walking with Jesus, but you've misstepped? You've fallen down, you've stumbled, and you need help. You need prayers. You need guidance. We would love to help in any way that we can as we sing the song that Dan has